Is the derivatives of the other trig functions that we don't already know. We already know the derivative of the sine, which is
cosine,
and the derivative of the cosine is
negative sine.
Negative sine. Okay, today what we want to do is take the derivative of the tangent. And we can find that now that we know how to do the quotient rule, because we know that we can rewrite the tangent as what in terms of sine and cosine? Okay, so we're going to take the derivative of the sine of x over cosine x. So to do that, we're going to use the quotient rule, which is the denominator times the derivative of the numerator. And what did you tell me the derivative of the sine is? Minus the numerator times the derivative of the denominator. And what's the derivative of the cosine? Negative sine. So this becomes a plus sine over the denominator squared. So we end up with cosine squared plus sine squared over cosine squared. And what is cosine squared plus sine squared? 1. And 1 over cosine squared is equal to secant squared. All right, so this is the derivative of the tangent. Secant squared x is the derivative of the tangent. And that's one that you could pretty easily follow, I think, how we came up with that derivative.
So all that is just like a proof?
Yes, but it's something I would expect you to be able to do, because now you know how to use the quotient rule, and that was not a real difficult one to do. I mean, everything's simplified out real nicely for us. So if we're going to talk about the derivative of the tangent, let's now look for the derivative of the cotangent. How can we rewrite cotangent? Cosine over sine. And one of the reasons it's good to know how to find, because some of them are real similar, and if you get them mixed up, if you go back and think about, okay, tangent is sine over cosine, what you can work through it to remember what that derivative is. This is cosine x over sine x. Okay, I want you to take a second and see if you can come up with the derivative for the cotangent. You end up, you have to factor out a negative on top because you had a negative sine squared minus cosine squared. So if you factor out the negative, you end up with cosine squared plus sine squared over sine squared. So the derivative of the cotangent ends up being a negative cosecant squared x. So that's, notice the cotangent and the cosecant. I mean, whatever helps you to remember. But the nice thing about the tangent especially is if you remember what the tangent's equal to, you can come up with the derivative fairly simply. All right, let's think about the derivative of the secant. Let me move this out of the way. Okay, how can I rewrite the secant in terms of something that I know?
1 over cosine x.
This is equal to 1 over cosine x. So the derivative of the secant is equal to 1 over the cosine x. And now we can use the quotient rule. Okay. So if we use the quotient rule, we've got the denominator times the derivative of the numerator minus the numerator times the derivative of the denominator, which is what?
Negative sin x.
Negative sine x.
Okay, so this becomes a plus sine x over the denominator squared. So this becomes 1 or sine x over cosine squared x. Well, that's not a real simple form. I can rewrite that as 1 over the cosine x times 1 over the sine x, can I? Is that legitimate? Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I wrote that wrong. Sorry about that. Sine x times over cosine x. Now that gives me sine x over cosine squared x. So we end up with, let me move it up just a tad. We end up with, what's this? 1 over cosine is secant x tan x. And that's the derivative of the secant x tan x. So knowing that, what we did with the secant and what we did with the tangent and then the cotangent, what do you think the derivative of the cosecant might be? Any guesses? Okay, negative cosecant x, cotangent x. Okay. So now we've got the derivative of the sine, the derivative of the cosine, the tangent, which is secant squared, the cotangent, which is negative cosecant squared. We have the derivative of the secant, which is secant x, tangent x, and the derivative of the cosecant, which is a negative cosecant x, cotangent x. So we have all 6 trig functions now. Let's work with a couple of them. If y equals x minus the tangent x, what is y prime? Sam, what's y prime? What's the derivative of x? 1. And the derivative of the tangent is? Did you write it down? Why didn't you write the derivative of the tangent? Maddie says it's secant squared x. Is she right?
Yes.
Okay. Y equals x secant x.